Chrissy and I live next to Rocky Flats. This is a topic that I feel like I may not do enough justice to. And there are definitely strong thoughts and feelings about this land, that I think are very important, and I want to make sure that I have time to highlight that, to kind of just think about these environmental traumas in a different light than how we normally talk about them. So, next slide. Oh, for those that are not in Colorado, Rocky Flats is just outside of the Denver area, south of Boulder. Um, and we've had two arsenal sites, one out here next to where we live, which is Rocky Flats, and the other one is Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which is out closer to the airport. Both of them were cleaned up as Superfund sites, and now both of them are wildlife refuges. So, next slide. So, a quick history. Rocky Flats operated from 1951 to 1992 as a weapons plant. They were owned, and I think this is very important of who the stakeholders are, by Dow Chemical, Rockwell International, and Egerton, Germantown, and Greer Defense, who is a defense contractor. They operated with the United States government, and they use plutonium and uranium to create these round pits that went inside of nuclear weapons. And that's what created the explosion. This site was used not just for nuclear weapons, but they also made some non-nuclear weapon components that really were responsible for building the United States nuclear arsenal in response to the Cold War. In 1989, due to reports from employees and other people who lived in this area, the FBI, EPA, and even what is now Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment raided in response to environmental health and safety concerns. After all was said and done, Rockwell pleaded to an $18.5 million settlement, which at the time was huge and one of the largest environmental crimes pleas of the time. After it was closed and stopped operating, it became a Superfund site. And as we move forward, it's important to remember CERCLA and RCRA, which stand for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Both of those were created as a national response to sites like these Superfund sites throughout the United States to help fund their cleanup. The Colorado Hazardous Waste Act was also part of funding cleaning up this site. Cleanup took place from 92 to 2006, and now there are two sites that kind of create two different zones within Rocky Flats. The Central Operable Unit is a place that is still confined to only certain people who can go there and have certain access. And then there's the Peripheral Operable Unit. And how I explain this to people is I feel that, like, have you all had a mole removed on your body? And when they remove that mole, they like to get clean margins to make sure that there aren't any other cells that could be cancerous within that portion of skin. So they basically did that with this site. So the Central Operable Unit, I would relate to the mole, and the Peripheral Operable Unit, which is now the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge, would be that margin error. This site was cleaned up to reflect background radiation levels of Colorado, which are higher than other areas in the nation just due to our geography and how close we are to the sun. The cost of cleanup for just Rocky Flats was about $7 billion, but online there are variable estimates for that. Between both of them, it was about 50 something billion. This only reflects the cost of the Superfund site cleanup. It does not take into account loss to wages, loss to work, loss to life, property values, etc., that are still affecting this region. So not just where I live, but in other areas of Arvada that are, within a 5 to 10, maybe more mile radius, people have to disclose when they sell their properties that they're within this area near Rocky Flats. Um, so these values are hard to measure, but as we talk and move forward in our discussions, especially as we talk with natural gas company or well, natural gas is a big lobbyist here, but also other gas, like people who are lobbying against the green movement. I feel like these values are very important to remind people, especially legislators, in the total cost to what environmental degradation does to our communities, because it's not just, oh, loss of jobs. Next slide. So these are quick maps. In the left-hand side, you can see that peripheral boundary is really highlighted well in this dark border, and the central area that is off limits is in the middle. In the next slide above, this is the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge, and it is open to multiple trails, connects to other wildlife areas. This area is significant because it hosts a huge elk migration, and other animals and species prosper in this area. So it's important. And then a picture of the land being used now recreationally. So next slide. Thank you, sweetheart. This kind of shows a picture over the times. So the gray picture is the full swing of the arsenal. There were multiple buildings, as you can see. And then as those buildings were cleaned up and remediated, so this would be that interior portion where most of that work and contamination was done. In 2005, all of those buildings had been removed. And then down below, this is a current picture of one of the entrances into the wildlife area. And that grassland has rehabilitated itself really well. And then the last picture is a picture looking towards downtown Denver from inside Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge. Next slide. So to continue to talk about the different health effects, we have to remember that there's two different types of radiation. So non-ionizing radiation and ionizing radiation, and it is very dependent on wavelength. Ionizing radiation has high energy and high frequency that can break chemical bonds. So that's why it's important when we're exposed to that energy, when particles start to decay, is strong enough to break apart the bonds of our DNA, and that's what causes cancer. Ironically, radiation is used to also treat cancer. And so I think it's very fascinating that the different mechanisms at play, one makes us very sick while the other is trying to cure a disease that it can also cause. Next slide. And then the other thing, how these can interact with our body is these particles have to decay to emit energy. So they're not super stable. And as they decay, they turn into a different product, often called a daughter product. And at that time, they release energy in the form of gamma, beta, and oh, my mind just lost me. There's a third type of radiation exposure, but you can kind of see in this chart where plutonium is decaying to uranium, and as it does that, it emits an alpha particle. Those are important because they have different frequencies and different penetration within our body. So if something, for example, if one that is not, I'm sure you all remember those plates that are radioactive and clocks, like the radium girls. Um, those decay particles, while on the outside of our skin, don't cause damage because we have a thick barrier. But if we ingest it into our body and then they decay inside of our body, that's when it can interact with our DNA and cause damage. So, in this scheme of things, it's important to remember the type of decay and where that decay, like the route of exposure. So dermal, and you can go to the next slide, Christy. So dermal inhalation or ingestion. So very alpha, beta, and gamma. That's what I was missing beta. So there you can see the different abilities in that top picture of those three different types of decay energies interacting with someone's hand. So if that is inside of our body, say when you inhale radon, for example, which is something that's ubiquitous throughout the United States, that can cause very different damage than if you're exposed to it on the outside of your skin. So route matters. So I wanted to go into the historical significance. There is a huge environmental legacy with Rocky Flats, not just through the contamination, but ongoing with water that runs through the land and multiple controversies that we face, such as should this land even be developed? My community that I live in is one that is still very controversial of if it should have ever been developed. Um, as I go into the public health implications and the workers that were exposed, I want to remind you that the plant started operation in the 50s. The OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Act, was not enacted until 1970. So legally, we did not have protections until April of 1971, where that act put regulation exposure limits to radiation. And I think that's really significant. So workers at the plant, not only due to lack of knowledge and probably some severe exploitation of their jobs, they were exposed to radiation and non-radiation contaminants. So those radiation exposures included photons and neutrons that were also inhaled and dermal exposures to plutonium, americium, and uranium. Those cancers include lung cancer, brain cancer, stomach cancer, rectal cancer, and multiple myeloma, which is a cancer of your blood and bone marrow. And then non-radiation exposures were to beryllium and asbestos, which can cause different lung diseases, and asbestos is also associated with cancer. There were multiple fires, but there were two significant fires in 1965 and 1969, and that greatly increased the risk to workers who were working at the time and to the surrounding communities because that created a smoke plume that then settled over different communities. Often here we only talk about Arvada and areas adjacent to Rocky Flats, but those plumes traveled south of here over to the greater Denver area. And those communities are not as well studied as the ones at closer to Rocky Flats for increased cancer rates if they exist. Another important thing to remember, just as we talk about exposures in general, is acute, a one-time exposure versus chronic exposures, which chronic exposures, as you're exposed to things, even if it's a low level, create a cumulative risk. So this is the part that I feel like our community is struggling with most today, which is the historical trauma or that intergenerational trauma of what community members and workers at Rocky Flats experienced at the time. And I do feel that there might be a psychological component to this, but it hasn't been well studied. And that is why so many folks don't want the area around Rocky Flats to be developed and have such a strong response to anything political that comes up in regard to this land. There are even people in our community who do not want the National Wildlife Refuges to be open and because of that historical fear of what has happened to others in our community. They witnessed their loved ones getting sick. They've witnessed so many different areas that they have been exposed to because of the existence of this arsenal, which creates pain, suffering, loss of loved ones in response to this exposure. Um, I had something important I wanted to add to that, and it is completely escaping me. So I apologize. It will probably come back. Um, but I think that's an important piece to remember in response to most environmental incidences. and other traumas that people experience. Um, oh, this is what I wanted to say. In the data that is currently shared in the scientific studies that have been done, and this is where I feel like loved ones who um, have family members who have died of one of these cancers may feel slighted is Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and other well-done studies show that there has been no increased risk of cancers and overall mortality in this area. And so if you're someone who has experienced that loss of life or saw somebody go through a traumatic cancer or long-term health consequence, those studies don't feel like they match what your lived history is. And I think that's also a very important piece as a community that we need to address. So next slide. This is a
Oh,
sign, and I
Lisa,
apologize.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're at 15 minutes, but
Okay, I am so
I want you to have
sorry.
a chance because you seem really passionate, and I just want to give you a chance.
There's just so much
Yeah,
here. So I
yeah,
just
there's a
want to
lot. There's
say,
a lot.
and you can come back to this and read it, but this is
Hmm.
the importance of the refuge. It hosts so many different species of wildlife, but also in response to a lot of this trauma, they have had to include information about risk. And so this slide kind of just goes through that, there is not increased risk at this point in time to those who use the refuge or live around it. Next slide, Christy. And then just the call to action and some quotes from people. Rachel Carson is the author of Silent Spring, which is kind of the founder of environmental health and these movements and Superfund and CERCLA and those types of environmental regulations that we do have today. And then environmental public health to me and what the Green Amendment does now is prevents exploitation of our environment, our resources, and human health, promotes environmental justice, protects our environment and human health from inequities, and prepares us all for our future.
Wow, that's awesome.
And I have included all of the resources because there is just such a significant amount of information, just both historically, information on how radiation works and causes harm, and some of those studies that I talked very briefly talked about. So if anyone is interested, there's a wealth of information.